Welcome to the Next Pitch Podcast, hosted by Kate Love.
Hello. Welcome to episode 1 of the Next Pitch Podcast. This podcast has been such a labor of love and such a dream. I'm so happy it's finally here. I'm happy you guys are going to get to hear the conversations that we've had. I'm joined by my producer, Lucas Still. Lucas, how's it going?
It's going well, Kate. I noticed that you got a nice little sweatshirt there. Barry Bonds is a Hall of Famer. Are you wearing that because no one was inducted to the Hall of Fame this last week?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I've had like a pretty bad sports week over here. I'm pretty bitter about the Barry Bonds situation. If you follow me on Twitter, you would see that I had very, very strong opinions about these writers who feel like they're the moral gatekeeper to the Hall of Fame. I think it's ignorant to think that this game isn't without its shortcomings. Obviously, just look at what Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron had to endure just to play the game of baseball, right? And if a guy had a Hall of Fame career, then he should be in the Hall of Fame. And that includes guys that I don't necessarily agree with all the time, like Curt Schilling. But definitely Barry Bonds. If he doesn't get into the Hall of Fame, then it loses literally all meaning for me. The thing that makes me the most mad is that we saw 14 blank ballots. 14.
Yeah, that's crazy. And growing up as a San Francisco Giants fan myself, Barry Bonds was the best hitter that I ever saw. And I've never seen someone intentionally walked so many times with the bases loaded.
He holds the record for most intentional walks. Speaking of San Francisco, we actually have a really great interview with the coordinator of pitching sciences for the San Francisco Giants, Matt Daniels. He kind of lets us into his life journey so far, how he got here. He gives great advice on getting into the game. He definitely took an atypical route, a guy with a finance background who has literally had his handprint all over the game of baseball. So maybe I'm just in a Giants frame of mind, but I'm just feeling particularly salty this week.
Yeah, we definitely have a great interview coming up, and Matt's a great guy, and you guys are going to love it. But before we jump into that, Kate, you mentioned you're having a salty week. In addition to Barry Bonds, I know you're from Houston. Talk to me a little about the Texans. What's going on over there?
It is an absolute dumpster fire. If you thought 2020, the year, was a dumpster fire, the Texans organization is putting on an absolute freaking clinic right now. I don't want to get into specifics and speculate on will they or won't they. Obviously, there's a lot of question marks around Deshaun. There's a lot of question marks around JJ. What I do want to talk about is the change that we have seen social media make in the way organizations are held accountable. I know you and I kind of talked about this before we got on air, but what we've seen since social media has come to rise is the difference between, one, information is just at our fingertips constantly, right? Like I was talking to you about, like, your dad's a Niners fan, has been a Niners fan for forever. What do you think that he knew was going on with the Oilers back in the 80s?
Absolute zilch.
Yeah, and now it's just like you log on to Twitter and it's information overload, assault in your face. My grandmother made the comment that our generation cares more about everything than her generation knew about anything. Like globally, we're more aware of everything. So it's kind of been this really interesting shift for me. I've said for a long time, and I'm sure you've seen it because you've been around several pros, that sports is the best field at making you feel like you have 90% of the picture with 10% of the information. It's very secretive. Organizations are shady.
Yeah.
Some organizations are shady, but when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, most owners are going to put dollar signs over players. It's rarely a story otherwise. So I just think that we're seeing this really interesting shift overall where we're kind of trending towards the like 30 to 40% of the picture is now visible, because players aren't only saying things to local media. They're not filtering anything when they are feeling these emotional things and I'm not saying that's what Deshaun is doing. Deshaun has handled this within the organization, but it's gotten out and it's helping his case. People have a hardline stance on this. I was telling you about this earlier, but I've recently gotten very into Formula One. If you haven't watched Drive to Survive on Netflix, you definitely should. But one of the things in there that I noticed, and I think part of the reason I'm so drawn to it, besides like the classic marriage between like the nerdy analytics that are just at the root of Formula One with like the combination of really advanced technology and then just like pure speed and chaos. Those guys are nuts, but they just don't feel any like filter in the media. And it's really changed Formula One a lot. I think it's changed the perception a lot. There's a driver, Daniel Ricciardo, that I really love because he's just like very open and funny and like has a personality. And that's not the way it was 10 years ago. And I think that it just continues to show that social media really is changing the sports world as a whole. It's not just changing the NFL. It's not just changing baseball. I mean, do you think the Rockies really wanted to trade Nolan Arenado? No one wants to trade Nolan Arenado. You get a guy like that, you're at a park like Coors Field where the ball just freaking flies. You don't trade a guy like that, but it gets out into the media that he's not happy, that he wants to go. You start feeling pressure from fans. People start looking at you a little differently. And what do you do as ownership? You usually finally cave.
Yeah, it's definitely social media is definitely giving players a voice 24/7, right? Like before 15, 20 years ago, they had their interviews, but you were prepared for the interview. You went home if you were upset. You didn't really have a way to express that. And now people have it on them 24/7. I remember growing up watching Bull Durham, a classic baseball movie where they had the cookie cutter answers they gave to the press, and you didn't really get to know what the player was actually feeling. Um, it's crazy how organizations can put this dollar amount on people and how money at the end of the day is obviously what's most important. In the gym, one of the guys that we train is Lucas Giolito, and he was almost had to go to court for arbitration this past week, and they ended up settling. But arbitration in and of itself is crazy to me. How a team can put you on the stand and be like, "Here's why you suck, X, Y, and
Here's
Z,"
everything that we actually hate about you, but we still want you to play for us
but as
this
cheaply
year.
as possible. And it's like, I'm your ace, I'm your best pitcher. What do you mean? So
Yeah.
I think that's just one example of how, yeah, these organizations might not be the most ethical and might not put the player's best interest always at front, but it's crazy. Social media is definitely a way where players have been able to kind of counteract the power that owners and organizations have.
Yeah, and I think the other way we're going to see that continue is obviously players are interested in ownership. You know, Patrick Mahomes bought a minority interest in the Royals. You don't think that that's going to be a cultural influence? His fiance Brittany, she is part of the ownership group for the women's soccer team in Kansas City. I think that Naomi Osaka just bought part of a soccer team, or I think that's what my sister told me yesterday. Don't quote me on that one. Um, LeBron James has expressed interest in ownership. You know, JJ Watt has expressed interest in ownership. I just think that we're going to see these cultures continue to change and become more transparent. And it's only a good thing for everyone around. And I just want to, this subject's always really touchy because we're talking about millionaires versus billionaires, and it's hard for the average person to feel sympathy in that situation. But the truth is everyone has the right to go to a work environment that is, what is the word I'm looking for?
Ethical.
Ethical, and just
You get
it really cultivates you as a human, helps you grow, right? So nourishing, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, but it's going to be interesting to watch. I don't think that the Deshaun Watson is the end of the Texans drama.
I just hope he comes and plays for the Niners.
That's just salt in the wound, Lucas.
Hey, we
uh,
had a brutal year. Come on. We had so many injuries.
did you watch the Texans this year?
Oh, Nick Bosa, first rounder, down, season-ending injury. Jimmy G out most of the season. George Kittle out most of the season. Raheem Mostert out most of the season. That's their whole offense and defense with Nick Bosa.
We didn't have that many injuries, but we didn't have an offense, and sure as heck didn't look like we had a defense either. So it was a rough year to be a Texans fan.
Well, despite all of the bad things that have happened this week in sports, I think we got a pretty good episode coming up. Kate, are you ready to get into this interview with Matt?
I have been waiting a very long time for this. Let's do it. Guys, welcome to the first ever episode of the Next Pitch podcast. I'm Kate Love. My producer, Lucas Still, is here, and I am here with a very special guest, my best friend of the last decade, Matt Daniels. You may know him as the coordinator of pitching sciences for the San Francisco Giants. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Kate, it's been a long time coming. You've talked about this for a long time, so I'm honored to be your first guest, and I'm really excited to have the discussion.
Guys, I am so pumped about this. I hope that you guys get a glimpse of the kind of conversations that Matt and I have, which are typically 5-minute phone calls that turn into hour and 15-minute phone calls going down YouTube rabbit holes. Matt, you've had a really interesting journey, and I don't think a lot of people know everything about it. You have climbed really high in the professional baseball world and have a lot of respect from a lot of people, despite not having the highest playing experience. And I kind of want to start at the beginning of that. You have had to fight every step of the way to prove yourself to be successful, to earn respect, to find your place in this world. Let's start at the beginning. Where do you think your first big aha moment was as like a baseball player?
I don't really know if there was an aha moment as a baseball player. I knew that I had a really successful youth career, and so I just automatically thought I was going to be a big leaguer. I quickly found out as I got older that was going to be much more of a challenge than I expected. I got passed up skill-wise, as well as body-wise, early high school, and that was tough to deal with. And I just never really figured out how to compete with those guys on my own. And college recruitment comes around. I had a couple of low-level 4-year offers, some JUCO offers, nothing substantial to the bar that I had set, nothing compared to the bar that I had set for myself. And I knew that I had to figure out how to do something different than what I was doing, but I didn't know where to look. And a friend of mine had trained with this guy named Ron Woolforth at the Texas Baseball Ranch. And my dad was willing to take me up there once a week, and I had to figure out how to do all the work on my own. And I had a really good senior year of high school after that, had some D1 attention, nothing materialized. I ended up going to junior college, but a pretty pivotal moment happened that summer after my senior year of high school, and that was meeting Trevor Bauer. And I never really had this understanding of how to coach myself. And I remember the first conversation I ever had with him, he invited me to watch film of him comparing himself to Tim Lincecum. And while we were doing this, he was pointing out all these things about what he's trying to train himself to do. And it just kind of clicked to me in that moment that this is a guy who is having a lot of success just coaching himself. I didn't even think that was a thing. Like, I grew up in Texas where you're raised to basically respect adults. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. And you just kind of do what you're told. And it never, ever occurred to me that I could just go learn the information and be my own coach. And that was the most mind-blowing thing to me back then. Nowadays, you have Twitter. It's almost expected that players who take their craft seriously are going to be on Twitter, be on YouTube, look up all this information.
Just take some level of responsibility for their own training.
Yeah, absolutely. But back then, you had to find a coach. There wasn't all this information out there. There were certain pitching forums that Kyle Bodie and like Mike Marshall and some of these guys are on, but it was like a very small amount of people from my understanding. I barely even knew how to leverage the internet at all, let alone like find the pitching information I needed. So that was a very pivotal moment in my life. And from then on, I was on this quest to figure out how to train myself. And throughout my college career, I took a lot of lumps, endured a lot of ridicule in the process, endured a lot of failure on the field. But eventually there were moments where things started to look up from there.
I want to go back and touch on the fact that you were really successful as a youth player, because I don't know how many people have put two and two together, but you actually were on a really successful Little League World Series team.
Yeah.
And you played with multiple pros off that team.
Yes. One of my very best friends to this day, Randall Gritchick, was on that team. And there are many players on that team who played Division I sports and even professional baseball off that team. And it was just one of those things where we had the right mix of guys at the right time, and we were able to make it to Williamsport. But as a youth player, I had vastly more baseball specific skill than most of my peers. And when you're a youth player, the amount of testosterone you have and all that stuff matters a lot less. And so I was able to be very successful. But when my baseball skill was no longer a separating factor, once guys hit puberty and testosterone kicks in and stuff like that, now the engine you have to leverage your baseball skill matters a whole lot more. And that's where I was lacking. And I think even where I would still lack today, I still have like some genetic disadvantages that, I just don't have a lot of the same things that professional baseball players have.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel to Trevor too, because I not only did he teach you how to be your own coach, but he also overcame a lot of just non-athleticism as a player.
Yeah. He's been doing weighted ball training since he was 9-10 years old. He and Warren have engineered his own mechanics. They've trained in an unconventional way for so long. And I think he had some speed training windows when he was a kid that I probably didn't hit. That gets into really complex topics. But yeah, I mean, his experiences being able to train himself and all that stuff, it led to me eventually being able to train myself. And even though I didn't turn out to be a Major League Baseball player, there's a pivotal moment that I'll address in a little bit where I was able to translate all the information that I had learned and help others to make the most out of their baseball careers.
Okay, so I want to talk about your JUCO and college years, because you obviously went to junior college at Hill College. We were friends during this time. I don't know that was always the most fun of times for you. And then you were awarded a scholarship to UT RGV, which used to be UT Pan Am.
Yep.
Down in the Valley in Texas. And we were talking about this yesterday. The largest change I think we saw in you was in between your junior and senior year, where you realized it was now or never.
Yeah, I don't know if there was like a dramatic sense of increased urgency. However, I started to take my diet a lot more seriously, excuse me. And I knew that, like I said before, the engine, so to speak, my body was not up to standard for a professional baseball player. And I had been hammering baseball skill for so long and just beating my head against a wall that I was really starting to lose it mentally. And I knew that I had to change something again in order to break through that next level. During summer ball between my junior and senior year, I was at my host family's house. I'll never forget this. I was sitting in my bed at my host family's house, scrolling through Twitter, and I stumbled upon this yellow icon that caught my eye, and it said Driveline Baseball. And I click on it. And I think at this time it maybe had, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 followers, something like that. And I'm kind of just like scrolling through this Twitter feed, and I'm kind of reading these things like, man, I agree with a lot of this. Because even though I had been training differently than a lot of the people, a lot of my peers, I didn't necessarily hate everything that my peers did. And I didn't necessarily love every single thing that was different that I did either. And I felt like this Driveline Baseball person account had a lot of the right ways to mix like each of like the best of each world, I guess. And I remember a week later, I had like a mechanics debate with him online, and I thought I was right. He clearly thought he was right. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Let me defer to the one person I always trust about mechanics, Trevor Bauer. So I ask him, all right, here's what happened. Who's right? And Trevor responds and goes, yeah, I gotta say, Kyle's right. That guy really knows his shit. And what you have to understand about Trevor at this time is he gave like nobody credit for being smart. Like he had
Getting a compliment from Trevor Bauer is the highest pinnacle of achievement.
yeah, especially like back in 2013. Like he's a lot more open to compliments and stuff like that in today's world, but like back then, like he was a bit different. That's just how his mentality was. And so I knew at that time when Trevor said, this guy knows his shit, I knew I need to get to know Kyle Bodie. And from then on, I sent him a very long email discussing my story. And it took him a few days to get to it, but eventually he replied. And I knew that I had to see him. I had to go through my fall semester because it was too late to go in the summer. But I begged my parents for my birthday and Christmas present that this is all I want to do. All I want to do is go to Seattle and train. And we made it happen. I had a cousin stationed in the Coast Guard up there who let me stay at his house. And I went for a week. I trained with Kyle. I was the first person to wear EMG sensors at Driveline baseball because that's something that I was really interested in. I needed to do things differently than I always had. And so I was looking to any tech, any sort of help that was different than what I had already done. And Kyle gave that to me, and he helped me to learn different lifts in the process as well. By this point, I was pretty adept at squatting and stuff like that. And he helped me with deadlifts and other things that kind of completed my lifting routine. And that spring, I didn't pitch well. My velocity jumped about 5 miles an hour. I was sitting 90, 91 by the end of my senior year. And it was enough to where my dad really wanted it for me to keep training, to try to play professionally. I wasn't going to get drafted, but he wanted to provide every opportunity for me to get better. And I went back to Driveline after my senior year of college, at which point I trained for a month, and then I went back to school. And this is where the story really begins.
Right. So I'm assuming the thing that most people don't know is that your degree is actually in finance.
Yep. And so based on me finishing my finance degree, there's two parallel events that really shifted me from playing into coaching.
Right.
And so the first one is I'm at school and I get this call from a Phoenix, Arizona number who I don't know. And so I just let it go to voicemail. And sure enough, person leaves a voicemail, and it is Mike Rathwell, new CEO of Driveline Baseball, Kyle's new business partner. And he tells me in the voicemail they want to start a remote training platform. For those who don't know, up to this point, like I mentioned, Driveline had 1,500, 2,000, maybe 3,000 followers on Instagram, Twitter. So they were not well known. It was just this little business out of what I call grandma's attic. If you've read the MVP Machine, you've probably seen this already, but it wasn't really much of a business. It was just Kyle kind of training some guys. I think Weathers was up there at this point and stuff like that.
I think even if you ask Kyle about it, he'll describe it as like him pursuing his passion, that he never thought that this would turn into a full-blown business. He hoped, but he didn't think it was there.
Yeah, without a doubt. And Mike Rothwell was the one who was going to come in and help him turn it into a legit business. And so one of the first steps to this process was to generate more revenue. And a way to do that was remote training. And I was finishing school during this time. I was training myself to try to play professionally, but there was an opportunity for me to make some extra money. And I'm very fortunate that Kyle and Mike thought I might be a good fit to help run this remote training platform. And so this is where I really started to learn how to coach, because when you have to write things down in a document, you don't get to make hand motions and all this stuff to try to signal to the player what to do. You have to use very precise language in order to get them to understand the information and to be able to do it. So that was really important for me, and I rather enjoyed it. But there was another pivotal part going at the same time as this, where I remember I was in the grocery store and I had this little DVD player for a TV in my room. And this sounds like it's going to be not relevant, but I promise it is. And there's a section of movies, they're like $5 to pick up. And I see this one, and it's called The Social Network. And I had heard that it was a very good movie. And I thought, hey, I should buy this. And one of my finance classmates, his name is Nick Piontek, and we always did like homework assignments together and stuff like that. And I was like, hey, have you seen this? And he's like, no, but I've heard it's good. And I was like, well, you're not doing anything. Let's watch it and just hang out and kick it. And we watched that movie, and I knew from then on, I was not going to have a desk job. That was what changed everything for me. I didn't necessarily know if I was going to be a Major League Baseball player. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew at that point that I was not going to use my finance degree the way that it was intended. And after thinking a little bit, I was continuing to train. I was continuing to do my online stuff with Driveline. But I came up with this idea for like a music sharing social media app.
Right.
And the kind of the entrepreneurial side of me decided, hey, this seems like a decent idea. Let's talk to Nick about it. And so I did. I drew out some wireframes, and he thought it was pretty cool. So we started in on it, formed an LLC, entered some business plan competitions, and we actually like won a little bit. And this went on for a little bit of time. I finished my degree at the end of 2014, and I moved to Seattle to try to train myself. And I was working the gym floor to kind of make ends meet. I had a place to stay, and I was still running the online training. But I was also doing things like shipping packages and like whatever else, customer service, whatever else you could think of. Like when you're the first employee, like you just do everything. And that's kind of how it was. But I was also doing this app at the same time. Well, around March of that year, I guess 2015, there were a couple pivotal moments that led me to stop playing, like just stop pursue trying to play professional baseball. The first was my groin was really starting to give me some issues. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of at this point where I couldn't train through it. And I knew the recovery time, if I needed surgery, this was going to take a while to get over. And then did I want to go through that process? I really wasn't sure. The second was Casey Weathers was sitting 95 and got sent to extended spring training with the Indians. And right there, I knew that like throwing 95 was going to be at least a 2-year project for me. Mm-hmm. Casey Weathers is a former first rounder. Yeah, he's a little older, but he's sitting 95 getting sent to extended. And I'm just this nobody undrafted right-hand pitcher who's scraping 90 at times. And it's just kind of like, is this worth pursuing anymore? Like, do I get more joy out of playing, or do I want to start to find some independence in my life? Do I want to start trying to change the game in some way? So eventually that happened. Turns out as well, when you try to create an iOS app that directly competes with Apple, that doesn't tend to go far in terms of finding any sort of funding. So eventually we shut down that effort, and I told Mike Rothwell, all right, I'm in. Like, this is what I'm going to do full time. We're going to change the game. And that's where it started. I started working for Driveline full time. And the other thing too is like the plan the whole time, my dad was like pretty dead set on, if I wasn't going to play professional baseball, that he would help me go back to school to get my master's degree. And the last like couple months of my undergrad, I just really was not into it. It was a struggle for me mentally. And you might as well have said like, you're either playing professional baseball or going into the military, and it would have made no difference. Like I just did not want to go back to school. And so at this point, it was Driveline or nothing. I wasn't going to have a desk job. This experiment with the app didn't go anywhere. Okay, well, here we go. I'm going to live 2,000 miles from home, and I'm going to figure out how to be someone who changes baseball. That was the only option. Like I didn't have anything else to do.
So I want to touch on this before I'll get to what I'll call the Driveline era. But part of the reason this podcast is called Next Pitch is because that's a mentality I think both you and I have adopted. And it's something you say a lot. I don't know if you realize how often you say it, but anytime something doesn't go to plan, Matt is really good at taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture and going, all right, next pitch. And so I feel like the moment where you decided, I'm not going to play baseball, but I found something that I found a place I fit, that this is where we're going.
Yeah. And I think the next pitch part, sometimes you got to give credit where it's due. Unfortunately, I didn't just start saying that. That was definitely like Driveline slang. I don't know if it came from Max Gordon or Ochart or Bodie, but I feel like I heard it somewhere from one of those guys. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of it. I failed so much and I endured so much ridicule while I was playing that if you just dwell on the failures, you're not going to go anywhere. You have to be able to get rid of it and just keep moving forward. So yeah, I mean, next pitch, like that's the mentality. It's like, all right, well, this happened. Oh, well, next pitch, let's go.
Okay, so let's talk about Driveline. And for those of you listening at home who may not know this, the reason the three of us that are on this podcast right now are connected is because we all have a tie to Driveline. I worked at Driveline with Matt. Lucas was one of our trainees during 2016. Part of the reason that it's so fun for me to watch where Matt's going is because I both watched it as a best friend and also as a coworker at times. Driveline exploded in 2016. Let's talk about that. What was it like going from literally being in like grandma's attic to at one point literally looking at the space we were in and being like, I don't know how we're going to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was going so fast at that time that I don't even know if I had time to think about it. I knew that environment was going to play a big factor, and that was something I always tried to help cultivate on the floor. I almost wanted like every velo day to feel like a UFC fight was about to happen. Like that was kind of the mentality. I remember I always heard Trevor crank music at the ranch, and I always thought that was a good idea. And I wanted to make sure that Driveline had that. And so even during 2015, that's the environment we tried to create. We started to have some pro guys in the off season really have success improving their velos. Mm-hmm. And we knew that it was going to attract more people, and then it did. And I remember just feeling so overwhelmed, but so overjoyed at the same time, because we knew that everything was working. Not everything, but we knew that we were on the right track. And
stuff was working.
Yeah.
Things are clicking, things are moving. I want to touch on the culture thing, because to me, that was what struck me the most. So I got there at the beginning of 2016, literally like January 1st was my first or second day of Driveline. I started in Nashville. I was at ABCA handling that. So my first introduction to Driveline was Casey Weathers and Caleb Cotham. And if you don't know Casey Weathers and Caleb Cotham, they are two of the most thoughtful, brilliant, articulate people that I've ever met. They walk through things, and it just really set the standard for where it was going to go from there. And then when I got back to Seattle, I was just struck by the number of people. There's so many athletes who you see like, oh, I have to do this, I have to do this, and they just like go through the motions. And every single person who was training in that gym was held to the standard of, you're fortunate to be here. You will do this because you want to do it, because you want to succeed, because you care how it works. And that culture prevailed. I mean, I think it's the reason why Driveline ultimately is so successful. Like, you can't step into that gym and just go through the motions.
Yeah, it definitely started with high demanding athletes, guys like Weathers, guys like Cotham. The questions they ask you are very in depth, and they're going to make sure that they're entrusting their careers to somebody that they can trust, and someone who is going to give them everything they have, someone who's going to study more than anyone else, someone who's going to ultimately help them get the most out of their careers. And to that point, the first time I ever met Caleb Cotham was ABCA 2015. And we literally talked about Aroldis Chapman for like 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And he questioned me on every part of his mechanics. And at that moment, I realized like, I got to be ready to handle any sort of question from any athlete. Like if this is something I want to do. And so in turn, when you have athletes who demand that level of attention to detail and you create staff at Driveline that adheres to that level of detail, then you kind of expect the rest of the athletes to uphold that culture as well. And that's the standard we had. If you weren't up to par in terms of your work ethic, your attention to detail, you probably weren't going to last in those days.
There's a quote that I really love from 49ers coach Kyle Shanahan, who, when I was going into college, was the youngest offensive coordinator in the NFL. And his quote was, I studied every potential X's and O play and issue possible. I spent my whole life working on that. My goal was that any question a player could have about anything on the field, I'd be able to answer that. It's a different mentality, especially like you said. My first introduction to Caleb was him walking down the hallway, and we would not get further than 2 steps without him stopping and moving through a different part of his pitching mechanics as he was trying to explain what he was trying to accomplish. I mean, it's just different level. We'll call it big brain energy. You'll hear me say things that I don't like. I call small brain energy. As that like transcends into a college atmosphere. With the pros, I think it's easy to demand that level of execution. As we transcended into the college atmosphere, how difficult did you find to set that same standard?
In the 2015, 2016, even I would say 2017 for the most part, it was pretty easy because Driveline was trending up. It was exploding, but it wasn't necessarily a household name yet. And so as a result, the athletes you were getting were kind of the ones on Twitter looking to better themselves. So it was kind of this sweet spot where Driveline was big enough to attract a higher volume of people, but it was small enough to where that entire volume of guys was super dedicated to what they were doing. And that was kind of the mix, I would say, that summer of 2016 that really propelled things forward. And back then it was mostly velocity development because like there was a lot of low hanging fruit in terms of mechanics training, weighted ball training, and things like that to get more velocity out of guys that wasn't commonly done. So since then, obviously the game has moved in a little bit of a different direction. Not to say that velo is not still important, but back then it was mostly velo production, and we had gotten to the point where we were getting a lot of really good results, and it was largely because we were attracting a lot of really dedicated players.
I mean, I can definitely attest to that as being, one of the first or one of the college guys in that summer of 2016, a facility in Kent, Washington, where you had nothing really going on. Like all the guys that were making the trek that summer were guys that were serious about getting after and getting better, and guys that weren't usually at the high level D1 guys that had already had the velo or the attention or the success on the field. And that summer was really cool because for me, it was seeing this culture was something that I had never experienced before. And there was guys, as you said, it felt like a UFC fight on velo days. Everyone was there. No one was slacking off. Everyone was going about their work the right way. And I think that comes from the top too. Obviously, kudos to Kyle. I remember, especially that summer, right when you walk in, there's a list right on the wall of, the 15 Driveline rules of the gym. And one of the things that kind of came up today was one of the things was, don't use the word grind, as this is, a privilege. Like, you're not in Afghanistan taking fire. You're not in the military. Like, you get to pursue your dreams in this facility and get after it with guys that are, on the same mission, which is really cool. And just one more thing was, as you said, in 2016, it wasn't really that big yet. I remember when Steve and I walked in, and one of the first persons we saw was Kyle, just right in the middle of the floor. And he gave us a tour. And then when we went back the next year, we only saw him because he invited us into the 4-3, the second facility they had, where Tim Lincecum was, which was crazy. But it was cool to kind of see that explosion and that growth from Driveline.
Yeah, and touching on the environment thing, like, one of the most significant moments from the social network that stuck to me when trying to cultivate environment was the fact that there's a part where Eduardo Saverin is trying to create ads on Facebook, and Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want ads. And the whole thing is like, it's cool. Like, it has to be cool. And that was like the one thing that I always kept in mind, because when I took a lot of ridicule as a player, it's because a lot of the different things I was doing, like, yeah, it didn't help that I wasn't good, but also, like, it looked funny. It wasn't cool. And so, like, how do we take things that are productive, that are different, but make them cool? Like, no offense to Trevor Bauer, he was really good, but he wasn't cool. He endured a lot of ridicule as well. And so one of the problems we had to solve as a business is, like, how do we get results? How do we make it cool in the process? Because that's what attracts players to your gym, to where you can get more results.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to touch on, obviously, to give people some background without going too much in depth. Towards the end of your time at Driveline, you were really overhauling the training processes, really overhauling what I would call the Driveline Bible, rewriting it, updating it, getting it to the point where it needed to be, hacking the kinetic chain. I watched you work on that a lot. And I just wanted to ask you, like, how your outlook changed from, like, when you started at Driveline to when you left on the game of baseball as a whole. Not specific, like, oh, I went in and I thought I knew this and this happened. Like, what changed for you in those 4 years you were at Driveline?
Yeah, I would say that in the beginning, it was mostly velocity development. Like, there was a lot of stuff in baseball where, like I said, mechanics training, all that stuff didn't necessarily make sense in terms of, like, what you saw on a macro scale. And so that was kind of like one of the first problems to solve, is like, how do we just give better information for the bulk of baseball players to be able to train more efficiently? But eventually, when everyone throws hard, not to say that velocity doesn't matter, but you have to move towards other things. And so really, after writing the book, and that was a long process itself, but after writing the book, I kind of looked towards, like, what was the next thing? And that was pitch design. Bauer was doing it, but really it wasn't being done to scale yet. Right. And I knew that this was something that pretty much everyone in pro ball could agree on. We were still fighting a lot of battles on the weighted ball front. A lot of medical departments didn't necessarily agree with us. We had been at least on a couple of consulting projects at that time. We
had been banned by at least 2 professional baseball teams from their players using our products. They will remain nameless.
Many colleges as well. Most of that I went to.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. Like, there was plenty of places where we weren't necessarily popular. And I really felt like pitch design was going to be something that pretty much everyone could agree upon. Like, there's no world where getting more hitters out and developing nasty pitches doesn't make sense. Like, I mean, if you have the ability to do that, you should do it. It doesn't matter where the information comes from. If you have better information on how to get hitters out, then you should just use it. So I really didn't know much about, like, spin rate, spin direction, axis, shapes, anything like that. After writing the book, I pretty much spent all my time diving into that.
Mm-hmm.
And through Brooks Baseball and Baseball Savant and just watching tons of video, kind of got the hang of it. We had Rapsodo, used that quite a bit, had Edgertronic, was using that. And after a couple of, I would say, like working with players on some reasonably successful projects, towards the end of my time at Driveline, I started to figure out that, hey, maybe there's a transition to pro ball that can be made.
Right. And I want to go back. I want to give Kyle Bodie credit where credit's due. We talked about in 2016, there was a lot of focus on cleaning up some mechanics, working on velocity. We had an Edgertronic camera fairly early on in the process. At ABCA in 2016, Kyle was blowing up the Rapsodo guys, being like, I want one. I want to beta test it. I want one. I will buy one today. And they're like, it's not ready. And he's like, I want it. I want it. So I think Driveline's progression into like doing more pitch design, working more on the kinematics, working on everything was also dependent on where technology was overall. We weren't the Dodgers. We don't have $100 million research and development team. So I felt like that was a very natural progression. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Also, just like the weirdest fun fact ever, Caleb Cotham was the first person to get a live read on Rapsodo. He threw the first pitch to do that. He was like, when he did that at ABCA, they had not like actually tested it. It was just kind of like this product thing that was kind of a theoretical machine. They didn't actually know if it worked. And
Right.
Caleb actually like threw on it and generated their first live read. So
I just remember Kyle kept coming back to our booth with his hands in his pockets and he'd just be like muttering under his breath, like, I want it. I want it. So I don't know why they won't let me buy it. I just want the Rapsodo. So
well, it was pretty groundbreaking, like to have a machine that it tells you a lot of the very basic things that TrackMan does for like a fraction of the price.
Right.
I mean, that was something that could really change the game. Obviously it has, but
and it's usable in like a much smaller space than TrackMan was. So it made sense for a lot more facilities.
Oh yeah, exactly.
I want to talk about your transition into pro ball. But to start, what the heck is the coordinator of pitching sciences?
Yeah, in my first year as coordinator of pitching analysis, and truth be told, it's like one of those things where we really didn't know what to call it. My first year, a lot of what I worked on was pretty much pitch design related things, maybe some weighted ball stuff, but we didn't have like I would say like an expansive sports science department or anything like that. And I would say like a lot of our initiatives on the sports science front grew in year 2. Side note, I actually thought that Sig Maydal's title of director of decision sciences with the Astros was kind of cool. And so I thought like what if it could be coordinator of pitching sciences? And we were able to work that out. So it kind of fit more along the lines with not just being a guy who's like kind of this pitching analyst, but someone who kind of helps integrate like sports science and analytics and baseball coaching, integrate information from all those areas and try to give players like the most complete idea of who they are and what they can become.
One of the really cool things that I feel like I'm watching you do in pro ball is I've watched you, and this is something that you've always done, but you've always maintained that you need to be able to perform not maybe at the same level, but at a high enough level to earn the respect of the athletes around you. One of the things that I watched you do this year is you actually went to a lot of the staff that Giants have access to, and you have adapted a new meal plan. You're adapting a new weightlifting program. You're focused on basically practicing what you preach. How has that changed the way that you approach talking to players and coaching players?
Well, I don't know yet necessarily how it changes how I approach or talk to the players. Rather, I just hope that I can put myself through things that they experience on a daily basis. I can't necessarily throw 95. Like, I think that's pretty beyond my genetic capabilities.
Right.
But what I can do is go through the process of figuring out how to recover from throwing, creating priorities around getting my lifts in, getting my meals in, going through a lot of the same things that we ask of players. And truth be told, like, I would have player meetings and telling them, like, maybe certain guy needs to focus on more lifting or like better nutrition or whatever, and then I wasn't doing it myself, and I just felt completely hypocritical.
Right.
So I decided that for the sake of creating like the right priorities in my life to create the ideal my ideal work performance, that I was going to try to incorporate enough things that we ask of the players to, first of all, just benefit my health, but secondarily, try to create as much relatability as the players as possible, because I want them to feel like I'm in the trenches with them and not just talking a bunch of numbers and jargon at them all the time.
Right. Alex Coffey just did an article in The Athletic about Brian Bannister that was a really fun deep dive into kind of the way that his brain works and the insight that he gives on a day-to-day basis. What is it like to get to go to work every day with a guy like Banny?
Career changing, honestly. By how many years, I don't know, but being able to tap into his experience and be able to rely on him as a mentor it's changed the way that I look at the game entirely. It's changed the way that I do life in many ways. His ability to problem solve, to leverage his experience in the game to solve problems that are very complex very quickly, has helped me tap into my background in understanding pitching mechanics, biomechanics, etc., to basically just forward my ability to help players. And it's pretty incredible. He's awesome. One of the nicest guys in the game, one of the most knowledgeable guys in the game. And just even kind of his passion for photography, and even some of the stuff that he does, like some of the visuals he makes with like Adobe Illustrator, are just things that I know I can learn to be a more effective coach or mentor. And so by working with him, I look at him, he's like the standard in the game when it comes to like being a pitching analyst and coach.
Right.
And being able to like see where he is and where I'm at, it helps me keep my priorities straight, because I can see like where the standard is versus where I am. And I know where, like, how much the gap is in order to try to get as close to him as I can. And it's part of the reason for like asking for nutrition plans, part of the reason for asking for a strength plan. The amount of things I can do to be more effective at creating results on the field are really endless. You have a certain bandwidth and you kind of have to pick and choose what fits your identity. But seeing like what Banny does on a daily basis, it's pretty mind blowing. And I'm more than fortunate to be able to work with him.
My last question for you is stemming off of that obviously being a coach and being an analyst and getting into the pro sports field at all is not as two-dimensional as some people think. You are proof that you don't have to have a degree in science. You have a degree in finance. You're proof that you can work your way to where you want to be. Banny's proof that you have, the more depth you have as a human, like you can find experience and influence from almost anything that you're passionate about. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to somebody who is looking to break into this career path?
Whew. There's certainly more than one, but I guess I would say that you have to love it. Like, that sounds so cliche, but you spend a lot of hours learning information, dissecting information, being on the field with the players, being in meetings. And if you don't love it, it's going to wear on you and you're going to try to do something else. Yeah. I mean, you have to love it. Like you have to love it and you have to live it. Doesn't mean that you can't be a well-rounded person and have hobbies and things like that, because I have to do that. I love cars. I love metal music. Like there's different things that I'm into to keep myself sane. But when it comes time to work, it has to be something that you just love, and you have to have a natural curiosity for learning the information, for being relentless in your pursuit for on-field results. And most importantly, you have to be able to connect with the players. If you can't connect with the players, then it doesn't make a difference how much you know. So any method at all to connect with players, whether it's making them feel like you're in the trenches with them in the weight room, throwing wise, if it means learning Spanish, anything you can do to combine the aspects of pushing your knowledge of what you can teach the players and your ability to connect, like that's the secret mix.
Very good. Matt, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you taking your time, letting us pick your brain. I'm sure you will be back on this podcast before too long.
I'd love to be back. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on episode number 1.
Wow. From a finance degree to professional baseball, Matt's truly had an incredible journey and is already leaving his mark on the game.
Yeah, it's been really fun to watch as both like his best friend and a coworker at points. I don't think that Matt always takes the amount of credit that he should for the work that he's put in, but he's been integral to Driveline's success. It was really fun to watch him put in the work and do what he had to do. And I still remember when he like said that he was moving to Washington. It just seemed so off the wall to me. And then just like kind of watching him evolve and grow into that role. And then obviously the growth that we saw in 2016 was absurd. But I think Matt's going to do really special things in this game. And that's not even like a biased opinion. I think anyone that knows him is going to say the same thing. And I think he's going to be a really fun one to keep an eye on, and see where he goes in the game.
Yeah, Matt's a great mind. He's definitely doing a bunch of great things. I think we also have another special guest coming up next week. Kate, if you want to give us a quick preview on that.
This is a guest I'm very excited to have. The King of JUCO will be joining us next week. We're going to talk about growing up in South Korea, his moving to Canada and not knowing any English, but I'm mostly excited about it because I think it gives you a real glimpse into Eric Sim, the person, and kind of how he became the King of JUCO, where I don't think that story is always as complete as it could be. That one is going to be explicit, guys, so you're not going to want to listen to it around little ears, but I think it's a really great interview. So I want to thank you guys for joining us. Please subscribe, rate us 5 stars, leave a review, grab all of your friends' phones, subscribe on their phones, rate us 5 stars, and leave reviews. We hope you enjoy it, and we hope you'll join us next week.